James pulled into the driveway of his factory early that Saturday morning, expecting another calm weekend of getting things done. Without the usual weekday chaos, his small production business specialized in producing custom metal parts, and while his workers had weekends off, James often used this moment to catch up on documents, review stock, and inspect equipment. Without disruption, it was a habit he had come to enjoy. A few hours of concentrated work before leaving home, to cherish the remaining part of the day. But as he turned the corner and entered the parking lot, his stomach sank. The entire lot, his lot, was filled with cars. Not just a few vehicles, but at least a dozen packed into every free space. SUVs, sedans, a couple of pickup trucks, and even a minivan were spread haphazardly across the pavement. Some were double parked, others squeezed so tightly together that James had no idea how the drivers had even gotten out. His usual spot near the main entrance was taken by a shiny red BMW, positioned at an angle, as if the driver had purposely parked to block access to the front door. James hit the brakes, gripping the steering wheel as frustration flared in his chest. What the heck was this? His factory was private property, clearly labeled as such, with several signs along the fence and entrance. The no trespassing warnings were obvious, and yet here he was, staring at a parking lot full of cars that did not belong to his workers, his clients, or anyone remotely connected to his business. He put his truck in park and stepped out, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of the culprits. That's when he heard the soft sounds of laughter and music coming from the back of the factory beyond the storage units. Jaw clenching, he followed the sound, walking past the employee entrance and around the building. The scene that met him only fueled his anger. In the open space behind the factory, an area meant for shipments and cargo unloading, there was a full-scale gathering happening. Tables and chairs had been arranged, covered in plastic tablecloths, with food trays piled high. A small speaker blared pop music, and a group of kids ran around, screaming with joy as they played some kind of game. Adults sat in folding chairs, drinking beverages and talking, while someone manned a portable grill, flipping burgers as smoke rose into the air. It looked like a family barbecue, a cookout on his private property. James instantly noticed Kimberly, his next-door neighbor, relaxing comfortably in one of the chairs near the grill. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and a sun hat, sipping a drink like she didn't have a concern in the world. Her husband, Mark, stood nearby, chuckling with another man, while casually tossing a football between them. For a moment, James could barely believe what he was witnessing. His neighbor had actually organized a party on his land, without so much as requesting for approval. Taking a deep breath, he compelled himself to stay calm as he walked toward the group. "Kimberly," he called, his voice cutting through the chatter. Heads turned, conversations paused, and Kimberly slowly turned at her seat to look at him. "Oh, James," she said cheerfully, lowering her sunglasses slightly to glance at him. "Good morning. What brings you here?" James gazed at her, stunned. "What brings me here?" he repeated, motioning around. "This is my factory, Kimberly, my land. What are you all doing here?" Kimberly blinked, as if she had just now realized where she was. "Oh, it's just a small family gathering," she said with a casual wave of her hand. "My sister and her relatives are in town, so we thought, why not appreciate the pleasant weather?" James tightened his jaw. "And you assumed my factory lot was the ideal place for that?" "Well," Kimberly said, adjusting in her seat, "we required extra parking, and your lot is mostly empty on weekends. We thought it wasn't a major issue." James let out a brief, sarcastic laugh. "Not a major issue," he repeated. "Kimberly, this is private property. You can't just decide to use it whenever it's comfortable for you." Kimberly sighed theatrically and leaned back in her chair. "Oh, come on, James, it's just for a couple of hours. What damage is it causing? We're not disturbing anyone." James rubbed a hand over his face, trying to hold his composure. "You're intruding," he said firmly. "That's the problem. You didn't ask, you didn't get consent, and now my lot is entirely full of cars that shouldn't be here." Kimberly pressed her lips, looking slightly irritated now. "Well, you weren't using it," she remarked. "That's not the point," James retorted, "It's my property, not a public parking space, not an event area, and certainly not your personal extra parking space." Mark, who had been listening nearby, finally chose to speak. "Look, man, don't be such a tough guy about it," he said, tossing the football in the air and catching it. "It's just a small gathering. We'll be leaving soon." James faced him, his anger growing. "That's not how this works, Mark. You don't get to occupy someone else's land just because you feel like it." A few of the other family members were starting to whisper among themselves, sensing the unease in the atmosphere. Some of them looked embarrassed, others just frustrated that their fun was being disrupted. Kimberly sighed again and stood up, finally removing her sunglasses. "All right, fine," she said, raising her hands as if she were the one being sensible. "We'll move the cars, eventually." "No," James said sternly. "You'll move them now." Kimberly's expression darkened. "James, don't be ridiculous. We're in the middle of eating. We'll leave when we're done." James crossed his arms. "I'm giving you 15 minutes," he said. "If those cars aren't gone, I'm calling a tow truck." Kimberly let out an exaggerated laugh. "You wouldn't," she scoffed. James met her gaze, unwavering. "Try me." A tense silence settled over the group. Kimberly stared at him, waiting for him to back down, but James didn't budge. Finally, she huffed. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "You're really being a jerk about this." "James, I'm enforcing basic property rights," James shot back. 15 minutes, that's all you get." With that, he turned and walked back toward the factory, leaving Kimberly fuming behind him. He could already hear her grumbling to Mark, complaining about how some people just don't know how to be neighborly. James ignored it. He had given them their chance. If those cars weren't gone in 15 minutes, they were going to be towed, and he had no intention of backing down. James checked his watch as he stood inside his office, arms crossed tightly over his chest. The 15-minute deadline he had given Kimberly and her family was almost up. From his window, he could see the chaotic scene outside. People still lingering near the grill, some looking irritated, others pretending as if nothing was happening. No one was rushing to move their cars. He exhaled sharply. They weren't taking him seriously. Grabbing his phone, he dialed the number of a local towing company he had used before. When the dispatcher picked up, James kept it simple. "I need immediate towing services for unauthorized vehicles parked on private property. How soon can you get a truck here?" "About 20 minutes, the dispatcher replied. "Perfect," James said. "I'll be waiting out front." He hung up and strode toward the factory entrance, stepping outside just as the warm morning air hit his face. His presence alone seemed to alert Kimberly, who was now standing near the gathering, arms crossed, glaring at him like he was the villain in some personal drama. She must have noticed the look on his face because she immediately marched up to him, heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. "You're not actually serious about towing, are you?" she demanded. James didn't even hesitate. "Yes, your time is up." Kimberly let out a dry laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're unbelievable, James. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to get a car out of impound?" "That's not my problem," James said coolly. "You had every chance to move them yourselves." Kimberly whirled around and waved at her husband, who was still chatting with some relatives. "Mark, he's calling a tow truck." Mark turned, squinting as if he hadn't been paying attention until now. He groaned and walked over, rubbing his forehead. "Dude, come on," he said, voice edged with frustration. "It's just parking." James narrowed his eyes. "It's trespassing." Mark rolled his eyes. "All right, fine, well, move them. No need to be a hard-ass about it." "Too late," James replied. "The truck is already on the way." Kimberly threw up her hands. "You are being completely unreasonable." James had no patience for this anymore. He turned and walked toward the lot's entrance. Just as the first tow truck pulled up, its orange lights flashing. The driver, a burly man in a company uniform, hopped out and nodded at James. "Which ones?" James gestured broadly. "All of them." The driver let out a low whistle. "All right, let's get to work." As soon as the tow truck started backing up, the mood shifted. The people who had been lounging and laughing moments ago were suddenly panicked. Some jumped up from their chairs, running toward their vehicles. "Wait, wait, wait," one woman shouted, waving frantically at the driver. I'm moving mine, don't tow it. A man in a baseball cap fumbled with his keys, sprinting to his truck. Another driver tried to squeeze into his SUV before the tow driver could hook it up. The scene descended into chaos, with people scrambling to move their vehicles, some barely avoiding getting towed. But it was too late for a few unlucky ones. Two cars had already been hooked and lifted onto the tow truck, their owners screaming in outrage. Kimberly stood there, furious, her hands balled into fists. "You just made a huge mistake, James," she hissed. James met her glare without flinching. "No, Kimberly, the mistake was thinking you could do whatever you wanted with someone else's property." She didn't respond, just stormed off toward her husband, fuming. James watched as the remaining cars finally cleared out, the last of her family members driving off with angry glares thrown his way. The tow truck rumbled away with the two impounded vehicles, leaving behind only the remnants of their abandoned party folding chairs, paper plates, and a half-empty cooler. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. At least it was over, or so he thought. The next morning, as he sipped his coffee, a sharp knock at the door made him pause. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with a man in a suit, holding a thick envelope. "James Robinson?" the man asked. James frowned. "Yeah." The man handed him the envelope. "You've been served." James took the envelope, staring at it as the man turned and walked away. His heart sank as he read the first line. Plaintiff, Kimberly Fox. Defendant, James Robinson. Charge, unlawful towing and emotional distress. Kimberly was suing him. James stood in his kitchen, gripping the lawsuit papers so tightly his knuckles turned white. His morning coffee, once steaming and inviting, now sat untouched on the counter, growing cold. The sheer audacity of it all was almost laughable. Kimberly had the nerve to sue him after blatantly trespassing on his property. He flipped through the pages, scanning the ridiculous claims. According to Kimberly's lawsuit, James had unlawfully towed her family's vehicles, causing them severe emotional distress. She claimed her elderly mother had been forced to walk miles to retrieve her car, that her children were traumatized by seeing their relatives' vehicles taken away, and that the entire incident had left her, family feeling publicly humiliated and unsafe in their own neighborhood. James exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. This was insanity. She had no case. He knew that his property was clearly marked with no trespassing signs, and he had every right to remove unauthorized vehicles. But even though the lawsuit was absurd, he couldn't ignore it. He needed to act. After a quick search online, he found a local attorney specializing in property disputes and civil claims. The office was just a few miles away, so James wasted no time getting in his truck and driving over. The receptionist, a young woman with thick glasses and a professional demeanor, greeted him as he walked in. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," James admitted, "but I just got hit with a ridiculous lawsuit, and I need a lawyer fast." She nodded, clicking away on her computer. "Let me check if Mr. Hendrick is available." A few minutes later, James was ushered into an office where a middle-aged man, with graying hair and a sharp gaze, sat behind a cluttered wooden desk. "James Robinson, correct," the lawyer said, gesturing for him to sit. "Let's see what we're dealing with." James handed over the lawsuit papers, watching as Hendrick flipped through them with an unreadable expression. After a few minutes, the lawyer scoffed. "This is one of the most ridiculous claims I've seen in a while," Hendrick said, tossing the papers onto his desk. "Kimberly Fox is grasping at straws. She's claiming emotional distress, unlawful towing, and even property damage, though she hasn't specified what was supposedly damaged." James clenched his jaw. "I had every legal right to tow those cars." "You did," Hendrick confirmed, "and we'll prove it. But lawsuits like these aren't always about winning in court. They're about intimidation. She's hoping you'll settle just to make it go away." "That's not happening," James said firmly. "I won't be bullied into paying her a dime." Hendrick nodded approvingly. "Good. Then, here's what we'll do. First, I'll draft a formal response, denying all her claims. Second, we'll countersue for legal fees and damages due to her unauthorized use of your property." James raised an eyebrow. I can do that. Absolutely, Hendrik said, and it'll send a message that you're not someone to mess with. James smirked. I like that idea. Over the next few days, Hendrik put together the legal response, while James gathered all the evidence he could. He printed out security footage, showing Kimberly's family taking over his lot, screenshots of their vehicles parked illegally, and even old emails he had sent to the homeowner association about prior issues with Kimberly. He wasn't going into this fight unprepared. Then, just when he thought things couldn't get more absurd, Kimberly took things a step further. A few days before their first court date, James was at the factory, working late, when a commotion outside caught his attention. He stepped out to see Kimberly standing near the entrance with a small group of people, some of her relatives and a few neighbors. They were holding protest signs. James had to blink to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. One of the signs read, "Stop unfair towing." Another, "Property right Harris." Kimberly, dressed in a crisp blazer, as if she were running for office, spotted James and smirked, enjoying the attention. She called out. James folded his arms, unimpressed. "What the hell is this?" "A peaceful protest," Kimberly said sweetly. "We're raising awareness about unfair property practices in our community." James let out a short laugh. "Unfair? You mean like illegally, using someone else's land and getting mad when there are consequences?" Kimberly ignored him and turned to her group. "See, this is exactly the kind of arrogance we're dealing with." A few people nodded in agreement, while others looked uncertain, as if they weren't quite sure why they were there. James suspected Kimberly had guilt-tripped them into coming. "Here's a thought," James said, stepping closer. "If you're so passionate about parking, why don't you protest in your own damn driveway?" Kimberly's smirk faltered, but she quickly recovered. "We have the right to voice our concerns. You also had the right to move your cars before they got towed," James shot back. The small crowd murmured, some shifting awkwardly. Clearly not everyone had been fully informed about the details of Kimberly's little crusade. James decided he had wasted enough time. He turned to go back inside, but not before making one last statement. "You can protest all you want, Kimberly, but in court, you're going to lose." With that, he walked back into the factory, leaving her fuming on the sidewalk. The morning of the court hearing arrived faster than James anticipated. He had spent the last few days meticulously preparing with Hendrik, gathering every shred of evidence that proved Kimberly's claims were nothing but a desperate attempt to manipulate the legal system. Despite his confidence, there was still a simmering frustration inside him. He couldn't believe he was even wasting time on this. He had a business to run, real problems to solve, and instead, he was dealing with a neighbor who refused to take responsibility for her own actions. As he parked outside the courthouse, James took a deep breath and stepped out of his truck, the crisp morning air doing little to cool his irritation. The moment he approached the entrance, he spotted Kimberly standing on the steps, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, speaking animatedly to a man in a cheap suit. Her lawyer, James assumed. The moment she saw him, her expression turned smug. Well, she said, tilting her head dramatically. "Enjoy your morning, James. I hope you're ready to face the consequences of your actions." James smirked. "Oh, I am. The real question is, are you?" Before Kimberly could respond, Hendrik appeared at his side, clutching a thick folder of documents. "Let's get this over with," he muttered. The courtroom was smaller than James had expected. It wasn't one of those dramatic, high-profile legal battlegrounds you'd see on TV, just a plain room with rows of wooden benches, a judge's bench at the front, and a few people already seated, waiting for their own cases to be heard. James took his seat beside Hendrik, while Kimberly settled into her spot across the aisle. Her lawyer, a wiry man with an overconfident expression, leaned in to whisper something to her. Kimberly nodded, then turned to glance at James with a smirk, as if she had already won. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and an air of impatience, entered and called the court to order. The case was announced, and as soon as both sides were asked to present their arguments, Kimberly's lawyer shot to his feet. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a case of unlawful towing and deliberate harassment by the defendant, Mr. Robinson, against my client and her family." My client has endured severe emotional distress due to his aggressive and unnecessary actions, and we seek appropriate damages for the harm caused. James resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Kimberly was sitting there with a perfectly rehearsed, pained expression, nodding along as if she had suffered a life-altering tragedy. The judge didn't look impressed. "Mr. Hendrick," she said, turning to James's lawyer. "Your response." Hendrick stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's claims are not only baseless, but also a blatant misuse of the court's time. The vehicles in question were parked illegally on private property, and my client had every legal right to have them removed. Furthermore, the plaintiff was warned multiple times before any action was taken." Kimberly's lawyer stepped forward again, feigning indignation. "That's not true. My client was unaware that parking. There was an issue." James finally spoke up. "Unaware. There are multiple no trespassing signs posted around my factory. You don't accidentally host a barbecue on someone else's land." The judge raised a hand, silencing them. "Mr. Hendrick, do you have evidence supporting your claim?" Hendrick nodded and approached the bench, placing a stack of documents in a USB drive in front of the judge. "We have security footage, photographs of the posted warnings, and records of Mr. Robinson's attempts to communicate with the plaintiff before taking any action. Additionally, we are filing a counterclaim for damages incurred due to the plaintiff's unauthorized use of private property." Kimberly's lawyer stiffened. "That's absurd. This counterclaim is nothing more than a scare tactic." The judge inserted the USB into a small laptop on her desk, the screen lighting up. James leaned back, watching as the security footage played, a crystal clear recording of Kimberly's family invading his lot, setting up tables, unloading food, and completely disregarding his warnings. Kimberly's expression shifted. The smugness drained from her face as she realized the evidence was airtight. The judge clicked through several photos, each one capturing another undeniable moment of their trespassing. After several long moments, she exhaled and removed her glasses. "Well," she said, looking directly at Kimberly, "this is certainly not the picture your lawsuit painted." Kimberly's lawyer stammered, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, even if that's the case, the way in which the defendant handled the situation was extreme. He could have resolved this differently." The judge held up a hand again. "I'm sorry, but are you suggesting that private property owners are obligated to tolerate trespassers indefinitely?" The lawyer hesitated. No buts," the judge interrupted. She turned to Kimberly. "Miss Fox, I find it difficult to believe that you were unaware of the issue when the footage clearly shows you dismissing Mr. Robinson's warnings. Furthermore, the claims of emotional distress seem exaggerated at best. Unless you can provide any substantial proof that Mr. Robinson acted unlawfully, this case is looking extremely weak." Kimberly opened her mouth, then shut it. Her face was turning red. The judge leaned back in her chair. "I'm dismissing the plaintiff's lawsuit due to lack of evidence and clear indications that the defendant acted within his rights. Furthermore, I am granting Mr. Robinson's counterclaim for legal fees and damages. Miss Fox, you will be responsible for covering all court costs and any related fees Mr. Robinson incurred due to your actions." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Kimberly's mouth fell open. "Wait, what? You making me pay?" The judge gave her a pointed look. "Yes, Miss Fox, that's how it works when you file a frivolous lawsuit and waste the court's time." Kimberly's lawyer tried to object, but it was useless. The case was over. As they all stood to leave, James turned to Kimberly with a small smirk. "Looks like you'll have to find another place to throw your parties." Her face was a mixture of rage and humiliation, but she had nothing left to say. She stormed out of the courtroom, her lawyer trailing behind, looking equally defeated. James walked outside, taking a deep breath of fresh air. Hendrick clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, that went about as well as it could have." James chuckled. "Yeah, but something tells me she won't let it go that easily." Hendrick sighed. "Maybe, but if she tries anything again, you know where to find me." James nodded, shaking his lawyer's hand before heading toward his truck. As much as he wanted to believe this was over, he had dealt with people like Kimberly before. This wasn't the last he'd hear from her. James had won. The court had dismissed Kimberly's lawsuit, forcing her to cover all legal fees, and he walked out of the courthouse with the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. But even as he drove back to his factory, something gnawed at the back of his mind. Kimberly wasn't the type to take a loss gracefully. People like her thrived on control, on always having the last word. And if there was one thing he had learned about her, it was that she didn't know when to quit. That suspicion was confirmed the very next morning. James pulled into his factory lot, expecting a quiet, uneventful day. But as soon as he stepped out of his truck, he spotted something unusual. His factory gate was covered in something long, stretched-out plastic wrap, tangled up with cheap yellow caution tape. A hastily scrawled sign was taped over it. Closed, due to unsafe conditions by order of the homeowner association. James blinked, barely able to process the absurdity of it. Homeowner association. His factory wasn't, even under the jurisdiction of any homeowners association. This was private industrial land, completely separate from residential zoning. What the hell was going on? He ripped the plastic wrap off and stormed inside. Everything seemed normal. Machines running, lights on, employees working. No official notices, no city warnings, no inspectors, just that ridiculous sign outside. As he reached his office, his phone buzzed. It was Hendrik. "James, did you see the email I forwarded you?" Hendrik asked the moment James picked up. "No, what's going on?" "You're not going to believe this," Hendrik said. "Kimberly filed a complaint with the county, claiming your factory poses serious safety violations to the surrounding community. She's trying to get the zoning board to launch an investigation." James let out a humorless laugh. "Of course she is. Don't worry," Hendrik continued. "I already contacted the board. The complaint is completely baseless, and they know it, but she's clearly trying to make your life hell any way she can." James gritted his teeth. This wasn't about legal action anymore. This was a petty, desperate attempt at revenge. He glanced outside at the mess Kimberly had made of his gate, at the neighbors passing by and whispering about the fake notice. She wanted to tarnish his reputation, make it look like he was the problem. But if she thought he was just going to sit back and take it, she was dead wrong. He spent the next few days carefully dismantling every tactic she tried. When county inspectors finally showed up, they took one look at the factory and dismissed the complaint on the spot. Kimberly had no legal footing, but that didn't stop her from escalating further. First, she tried spreading rumors. One of his clients called him, asking if it was true that his factory was being shut down for safety violations. Another supplier hesitated on a delivery, worried about the bad press he was supposedly getting. James had to personally reach out to every client, every vendor, reassuring them that the allegations were nothing but the desperate acts of a bitter neighbor. He even posted the court documents publicly on his business website, proving that Kimberly's lawsuit had been rejected as groundless nonsense. Then things turned more aggressive. One night, security cameras caught three individuals, to be exact, sneaking onto his property under the cover of darkness. They weren't very skilled at it, though. The footage showed them cutting through the side fence, dumping a few old barrels and some building debris behind the factory, and then taking pictures as if they were recording some huge environmental violation. James sent the footage straight to Hendrik and the police. 2 days later, Kimberly received a very different kind of legal notice, one that accused her of trespassing, property damage, and filing false complaints with a government office. The police paid her a visit, and while she wasn't arrested, the message was clear: she had crossed the line. By the time the week ended, Kimberly's little campaign against James had completely failed. Not only had her initial lawsuit backfired, but now she was under legal examination. Herself. The neighbors who had once partially supported her were starting to step back, realizing that standing with her meant bringing drama into their own lives. James finally got the satisfaction of seeing her stay silent. No more protests, no more fake complaints, no more dishonest tactics. And just when he thought things had finally settled, he got an unexpected piece of news. One morning, his factory manager knocked on his office door, grinning. "Hey, boss, you're not going to believe what I just heard." James raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Kimberly and her husband are selling their house." James set down his coffee. Seriously? Yep. Word is, after everything that happened, they're moving. Apparently, people in the neighborhood don't want anything to do with her anymore. And well, she can't exactly return after suing a local business and getting publicly embarrassed in court. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling in amusement. That's true justice. A week later, a moving truck arrived in front of Kimberly's house. James didn't bother going over to gloat. He didn't need to. He simply watched from a distance as she packed up her life, loaded it into a truck, and left. She had tried to ruin him, tried to make him miserable, and in the end, all she did was destroy her own reputation. James went back to work, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Kimberly was gone. The factory was safe. His business was secure. And best of all, she was never coming back.